Hello, good morning, everybody. My name is Nils Roscher-Nielsen, and I'm here today with my colleague Jeff LeBlanc from ICS. Before we get started, I just wanted to go through a couple of practical things. This webinar is being recorded, so if you think it's interesting, feel free to download it after the fact. You can share it with your friends and family, or maybe your colleagues that might be interested in this specific topic as well. During the webinar, feel free to ask us questions in the question box that you have in the GoToWebinar tool. We will be monitoring those questions, but I do not think we have the time to go through all of them during the webinar, and not to interrupt the flow of the webinar, we will limit the questions to the end. So we will leave time for a Q&A session in the end. But feel free to ask questions during the webinar, and we will get back to those as soon as we can. So we are scheduled for an hour here. We're probably not going to spend all of the time, but we have a very interesting topic. So again, my name is Nils Roscher-Nielsen, and I work as a product manager with the Qt Company. We are here today with ICS, who will be talking more. But before we give it over to Jeff, I just wanted to give a quick introduction to our relationship and why we do this together. So the Qt Company is already more than 20 years old in its history, given a different couple of names and iterations. But we were the ones who created the Qt framework. We've been developing it. We are responsible for maintaining it, and have been for all that time. And I am based in our Santa Clara office on the west coast of the US, but we're spanning all different time zones of this little world of ours. So we provide support services, and we provide consultancy all around the globe. We have a lot of work going into the Qt framework, and our main business model to pay for that is through the Qt licensing. So Qt is a dual licensed product coming in an open source version and a commercial version. And we are, as creators of Qt, also the copyright holders and responsible for the licensing, both commercially and for choosing which open source licenses it's available under. But to augment that offering and to really provide a lot of value to customers, we understand that just getting the framework in your hands isn't always enough. So being able to get the services you need, get the help you need, that might come from us, but it's also beneficial to have a large ecosystem of partners around us that provide a lot of value to the Qt development framework. And today with us here in this webinar, we have Jeff LeBlanc from ICS. So Jeff, without much further ado, I think I'll just hand it over to you and let you introduce yourself.
Thank you, Nils. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, absolutely.
Excellent. Just always want to make sure. Okay. Hello, everyone, and good morning. So I am Jeff LeBlanc, and as Nils said, I am the Director of User Experience here at ICS. Just so you know a little bit about my background, I've actually been a software developer for over 20 years, and I have done quite a bit with Qt over the years. I've actually been a certified Qt trainer for a long time, and a little fun factoid, I was actually the first certified North American Qt trainer, certified by Trolltech way back when. I think that was Qt 3.1 or so. So I've been programming for a while. And my passion has always been user interface and user experience. and I've had the opportunity to actually teach, also known as HCI, Human Computer Interaction, as an adjunct faculty member at Worcester Polytechnic Institute, WPI, for those of you who are familiar with East Coast colleges. So that's who I am, and that's a picture of probably what downtown Boston is going to look like by the end of the day. For those of you on the East Coast, I hope you're enjoying our lovely blizzard that's raging today. So without further ado, let us move on to the meat of the presentation, which is actually talking about UX design. Now, something I typically ask folks when I'm doing this as a live in-person presentation is I ask my audience, who is typically developers, who has coded a user interface before, because you actually like creating UIs. And that makes people think of how much are they coding because they're really into user interface and they like doing front-end development, or is it something that they're coding up because they've got this great back-end service and, yeah, okay, I got to slap a user interface in it for those users to actually use my product. So typically I get much more people who answer the question of, yeah, we've got a great back-end, we've got great functionality, and okay, we have to slap a UI on it. Well, that becomes problematic fairly quickly, because as soon as you start to think about slapping a UI on, you're forgetting that you're not the person using the system. It's somebody else, and ultimately the success or failure of it isn't going to be determined by how cool your code is. It's going to be determined by, can other people actually use your interface. So you got to care about UX, at least to some degree. Qt and QML are great tools. They're very powerful. They can let you make some absolutely amazing things, but they focus on the how of it, the programming. What are the features? They don't necessarily focus on what it is that the user sees. And as software developers, and again, I get it. I've done years and years of coding. You have to focus on the how. How am I going to pull this off? How am I going to make this feature work? How am I going to deploy it? How am I going to get it out into the field? The end user comes in at the end. They get the benefit from all your hard work, and I hate to say it, but by and large, they don't care how hard it was. They care about, what does this app do? What does this application do? What can it do for me? Is it something that's going to make my life better? Is it something that's going to be fun? They care about what it does. They don't care about the how. So that starts to really shift your perspective a little bit in terms of thinking, what is their experience going to be? If you're doing mobile apps, there are some statistics out there in the industry that say from the time that somebody downloads your application, installs it on the phone, brings it up and starts looking at it, at your first impression time, you've got about 30 seconds to make a good first impression, or somebody's going to move on. That's it. There are plenty of free apps out there. If your application doesn't do what they need, if it doesn't grab their attention, if it doesn't make them go, wow, this is pretty cool, they're done. They'll move on and they'll go to the next app. That visceral impact, as we call it, is that first user experience. And that is what's going to make somebody keep using the app beyond those crucial 30 seconds, and it's going to, even more importantly, make them recommend it to other people. If you use an application, if you're like most folks, you talk about it. So, hey, I just downloaded this new app, it does a cool thing, or, oh, I heard you talking about such and such. I've got an app that does that. I really like it. Check it out. And that recommendation is gold from a business perspective. So you need to think about that. Bad design really makes a difference, and it's something that as developers we got to kind of pay attention to. It really does have an impact on people's lives. If it's a piece of software that somebody absolutely has to use because it's part of their job, and the experience isn't a good one, if people struggle, if they find it frustrating, it's hard to use, it's going to add to their stress. If you're doing commercial software, that could cost you business. Okay, because people aren't likely to buy the next release of it. And quite frankly, bad design can cause errors, and that can actually cost lives. If you're developing software that works for mission-critical systems and it's got a bad interface design, honestly, it really could cost lives. The book that I reference on the side here, The Human Factor by Kim Vicente, if you're a UX geek like I am and you're interested in some interesting anecdotes from the industry about both good design and bad design, check it out. There's some very chilling stories in there from the medical industry about literally how bad design can impact people's lives. On the flip side of that, good design also impacts people, and from a better perspective, it can improve their job performance, it can improve their job satisfaction. And we've all been there, staring at a screen for 8 hours a day and using different pieces of software. And when we get a tool, because that's what software is, it's a tool to help us get our jobs done. If we get a tool that we like, that the workflow is good, that we don't have to think about the interface, we can just get our job done and life is good. Think about using some of the iterations of the Qt designer and some of the IDEs that are out there for code development. You don't think about the user interface that much, you just do your job. Okay, and that means it's a good design. So good design will help people. It really can save lives if you're in the medical industry, and quite frankly, it'll make people want to use your product and keep using it, and that will get you, from a business perspective, more customers. So to kind of explore that a little bit more on the business side, customer satisfaction is one of the keys out there to increasing revenue. If the customers are happy, they will buy that all-important upgrade or maintenance release or whatever the next version is, and that's just good business. There was a study done, and I don't have a lot of the reference links on this, but as we know, Google is your friend. These were all things that were very quick for me to find. Wixon and Jones did a case study, and they found that for some of their clients, people that focused on usability were able to get revenue increases of up to 80%. Right? And there's a lot of metrics out there. Companies like Apple, like Amazon, that really focus on it, and that impacts their business in a positive way. A good user interface or experience can help reduce training and support costs. I did a project a few years back with a client who on day one was just talking about all the support problems that they had because technicians in the field were setting things up, and then they're naive users. Those users, they were messing things up. Well, that was an interface design problem. You were giving those users access to things that, quite frankly, only the technicians should have. Once we did a redesign, a lot of those support costs went away. In 2005, McAfee, the company that brings you some of the premier antivirus software out there, you generally don't see antivirus software, but there is an interface to it. There's a control panel, and it used to be complicated. They redesigned that control panel, and it reduced their support calls by 90%. Same functionality, same feature set, but focusing on the redesign of the interface dropped their support costs down. If you're a business person looking at this, you cannot ignore numbers like that. So from a business perspective, user experience is really going to matter. Now, I keep using UX and user interface UI somewhat interchangeably, and they are very close to each other, but there is a slight difference. The thing to keep in mind is that any piece of software has an interface to it. Anything that you create that somebody interacts with, that is the interface to the user interface. UX is a little different. That kind of asks the question of, yeah, it has an interface, but how do you feel after using the interface? And that's really not a touchy-feely type of question. I mean, it literally is, what was your impression of it? What was the visceral impact you had of just looking at that for the first time and starting to use it? Did you enjoy using the piece of software? Okay, or at the very least, did you not dislike using it? Would you willingly use it again? And more importantly, would you recommend it to others? Those are experience things. Features are great. Features go a long way, and features might be why you initially download or install a piece of software, but repeated use comes as much from experience as it does from features. So as engineers, you need to think about these things. How is your software going to be received out in the marketplace? And honestly, this can be a challenge because software engineers, no surprise, we think like engineers, right? When you're designing software, you're in the zone, you're working on code, you're dealing with the compiler, you're dealing with the operating system. Engineers have a very particular what's called a mental model. It's how we view the world. Anybody who's watched The Big Bang Theory can kind of get that. There are people who think like engineers and there are people who don't think like engineers. Different mental models. And that's something to keep in mind. Who are your target users? What is their mental model and view of the world? Engineers also have a different skill set than UX designers and visual designers. UX designers are trained to put themselves in the shoes of the end user. That's their job. How does the end user think about this, and what can they bring to the table to help impact the design? If you're an engineer and you're designing a piece of software, and you can look around in the industry out there's plenty of examples, a lot of times you only get an interface that's going to make sense to other technical people, right? As engineers, we like to figure things out, and it's somewhat of a challenge. I take it as a point of pride that I will never look at an instruction manual, at least not out of the box. If I can't figure it out, I consider it a design problem. But I like that. I enjoy doing that, and not everybody does. One of the key tenets in the user interface community is know thy user. Right? That was a phrase that came around by a gentleman named Fred Hansen back in the 70s, and it truly is one of the core principles of user interface and user experience design. So, if you have to design a user interface because somebody who is not an engineer is going to use it, what do you do? Well, there are a few things to keep in mind, and there are some very obvious, very easy things that I'm going to give you guys that will help you get going. You really just got to remember that you are not the target user, all right? If you can ask questions of people, ask somebody who is not an engineer, maybe it's sales, maybe it's marketing, maybe it's your significant other, whatever it might be, but think about who's going to be using this out in the field and get some opinions on can they use it. If you have the luxury to work with a UX designer, do so. As Director of User Experience here at ICS, I head up a team of UX designers, and the people we work with are engineers developing software, but they're also the end users of that target software, and we help to bridge that gap to make a better product. Keep in mind that there are guidelines for designing user interface. There are some very easy to follow heuristics, which I'm going to go over with you in a moment, and quite honestly, it's often about the same level of effort as to implement a UI in the right way as it is to implement it, as I say, the wrong way, a way that might be confusing to an end user. If you have two paths, A or B, and one is easy for the user and one is not, well, choose A if the level of effort is a wash. So what I want to go over with you folks now is a set of 8 golden rules for interface design. These were put together by Professor Ben Schneiderman at the University of Maryland. He is one of the rock stars in the usability field. There are other sets of heuristics that are out there as well. They're very similar. The Nils and Norman group has a set of 10 that they use. I prefer the 8, but they're very similar. And rather than go through this this number list, I'm going to go through each one in detail and try to give you guys some examples and see how we can apply this to software design when we can. So rule number 1, strive for consistency. Whenever possible, be consistent, and that can be either within your product. Okay, maybe you've got an application that has multiple screens in it. You want to make sure that, as a simple example in a dialog box, if you use OK cancel on one dialog box, you don't use cancel OK on the other dialog box. Pick one and go with it. Okay, and this might not be just for you as a single engineer. Maybe you're doing OK cancel and the guy in the next cube is doing cancel OK. At some time you have to get on the same page. Be consistent. So that can be either within your single product. It could be across multiple products with the company. Maybe you're doing a next generation of, again, product A, and you got another team that's working on product B, and product B already has a new look and feel to it. You might want to make them look like they're produced by the same company. There are business reasons for doing that. A look and feel is certainly something that can be marketed, and that's something that will benefit the sales and marketing folks, bringing in business. So consistency can even be just within the software industry. Control-C to do copy, kind of an industry standard as a shortcut. So if you're doing an application that has a copy in it and you want to make keyboard functions, it really better be Control-C because most other pieces of software work that way. Consistency is beneficial to the user because it helps in transfer of learning. Again, if I'm used to using Control-C as copy for, let's just say PowerPoint, for instance, since that's what's in front of me right now as I do this webinar. If I go to another piece of software and I highlight an item or an object and I want to say, oh, I'm going to copy this, I'll hit Control-C just on habit. Okay, and if it works, great. So I've transferred my learning from PowerPoint to my new application that benefits me as a new user. Consistency is probably the most frequently violated or ignored rule of the 8, and it's actually the simplest. It just takes a little bit of thought, communication with your peers, and you can get that consistent look and feel across the suite of applications that you're working on. So a good example of this visually, as I mentioned, PowerPoint. This one's a few years old, this one, when Microsoft first introduced their ribbon style of interface. We're not here to discuss the merits or not of the ribbon. It had its issues, but it was consistent. You look at Word, Excel, and PowerPoint, and you say, yeah, okay, those are 3 different pieces of software. They do 3 different things, but I can very much see their pedigree. They look like they were all done by the same company. They have an obvious style, a top header bar. I know from experience that the shortcuts work the same way. So, kudos to Microsoft for, in this particular case, following Rule 1 and making their product suite consistent. Rule number 2, catering to universal usability. This is one of my, if I have to rank them, one of my top ones. This is designing software to be usable by what we would consider the widest range of reasonably possible users. And by reasonable, you have to kind of look at who's using this, and I usually kind of try to hit the 80-20 rule. If 80% of my possible users can use my software, I consider that a win. For example, designing voting software. We just had the election, voting software was used, so the possible user base of that is anybody over the age of 18. So that's young people all the way up to people in their 90s reasonably, maybe some folks even cracked 100 and they were voting. More power to them. How do you design software that works across that wide of a user base? It's a challenge. There are a lot of factors to consider. You have to consider people's physical abilities. Okay, vision being the top one of the batch. When I was a young programmer and designer, I didn't think anything about having these eye-bleeding fonts. Now that I'm looking at 50, I want to be looking at things with a wider font choice to them. So I need bigger text. It's just the way it is. Our eyes get worse as we get older. Coordination becomes an issue too. Hitting touch targets that are too small or too close together can be a challenge for some older folks. We have to consider cultural differences. Are we just deploying within the US, within the Western world, within a particular part of the globe? What cultural considerations go on choices of colors? Does a color have a certain connotation in one culture versus another culture? Icons, same way. Designing a set of icons that is universally usable across the planet is really, really hard to do. You want to avoid things like hand gestures, facial expressions, just kind of people-related things in general. For example, in the U.S., we have the symbol or the hand gesture with the thumb and forefinger, where you make the O, kind of the OK sign. That means something very different in Germany. If you're driving on the Autobahn and somebody shows that hand gesture to you, they're not complimenting your driving. Right? So you want to be a little careful about choices that involve hand gestures, as for example. Avoid those if at all possible. I mentioned technical experience a little bit in the context of the voting booth. You might be designing something for people with a range of experience that vary all the way from engineers and scientists down to people who never completed high school to children. There's a wide range of experience there that you might have to cover. And finally, human perception. How do we perceive things not only from a vision perspective under good conditions, but how do we perceive things under alternate conditions? You know, what if you're under emergency lighting, or if there's a power failure or solar glare or things like that? How does your application respond? So I consider this an interesting one, because really, under the right circumstances, anybody, even if you don't have color deficiency, can have a vision problem with color. The statistics for color deficiency are about 10% of men and 1% of women have vision issues related to color. The example that I'm using here, this picture, is from the movie The Abyss. If anybody remembers this one, it came out back in the 80s. I'm guessing a lot of you may not have even been alive at this point when this movie came out, but bear with me. Minor spoiler for it. Towards the end of the movie, the hero is down at the bottom of a trench in the ocean trying to defuse a nuke, and all he has is one of these green light sticks, and the person up on the surface is trying to talk him through it, and they're saying, oh yeah, cut the blue wire with the white stripe and not the black wire with the yellow stripe. Well, guess what? Under that circumstance, it's a coin toss. I won't spoil the movie in terms of how it came out, but let's just say that if they had used secondary encoding, which might have been a dashed line on one of those so you could tell the difference, the filmmakers would not have been able to use that little bit of stress in the movie. So secondary encoding to go with color is a good thing. Next one, offering informative feedback. Right? For every time your software does something, tell the user that something happened. They should never be sitting there going, well, I pressed the button, didn't do anything. What's going on? Controls should have descriptions. You know, maybe it's a text label, maybe it's a tooltip, a hover over, whatever it might be, describing not only what is possible, but what is not possible. If you gray out something, tell the user why. So if they go to press the grayed out button, it says you cannot press this because certain conditions have not been met. Whenever you do something that triggers a long operation, you know, maybe take a web browser, for example. You go to a website, the web browser gives you a little spinning icon, you know, something that says, yep, I got your request, I'm working on it, I'm going out over the internet to get it. Without that, you don't know if the software crashed or not. And everybody's first inclination, if they press a button and nothing happens, what do? You press it again, and again, and again, and again. And depending on how the code is written, suddenly you might have triggered 3 network accesses or database accesses or whatever it might be on the back end, because you got 3 signals that came through that said, oh, the user wants to do this 3 times. So give them feedback. Let them know that something is going on. Try not to leave them hanging, and that will make life easier for them. Number 4, with dialog boxes. Design them to yield closure. Okay, a dialog box is something that it's really a badly used user interface paradigm. There is a school of thought that says don't use them in general, or ever, actually, which is a bit of a challenge, but for better or worse, they're in there, and Qt certainly has some great support for them. But when they come up, the user wants to understand why they're there. You know, they should pop up for a reason. There should be an obvious set of steps that the user has to go through to dismiss the thing, and there should be a nice, well-defined outcome. Right? Give an indication of a success or failure. You know, why is this dialog here? What's going to happen if they press it? Was it successful? Right? So if you look at the example I have in here, it's a very poorly defined one, because it says, are you sure you want to delete this thing called ridges? Well, there's only an OK button, and the X in the upper right-hand corner is grayed out. So I guess you better want to delete ridges because you don't have any other choices. Moving on to number 5, error prevention. This is my top guideline. Right? If you take nothing else out of this presentation, think about this one. Make errors as impossible as possible. Whenever you can, you guide the user towards whatever the correct actions should be so they can't make an error in the first place. Okay? Gray out things, make them insensitive. Provide selection options instead of freestyle typing. So instead of a line edit, maybe you use a Qt combo box instead. If you can provide automatic completion, so you have to type less, that's a good thing. Input validation, use validators, right? Validate that input. So again, the user can't make an error in the first place. Now, my personal opinion on this is when we were at university and we were learning to be software engineers, we took our beginning computer programming courses. And some of those early programming courses started with enter in a number, and if it's outside of the range of 1 to 10, tell the user they did something wrong. Right? At least that's what I started with back in the dark ages of programming. But that leads to a mindset that says it's okay to give the user any choice they want, and if they screw up, well, too bad on them. So we've gotten into this habit of letting users do that, and we just slap up an error message at the end. The error message is often poorly worded. It doesn't help the user figure out what they did, and it's really just a bad user interface style. Now, there are times when, yes, things are out of the user's control. Danger, the hard drive is melting, you need to take action. Okay, those are asynchronous things that we do just have to put up a message for. But whenever possible, if we can't prevent the error in the first place, make the error message very specific, very positive, and very constructive so that they can actually fix the problem. But remember, if you can prevent that error from happening in the first place, you don't need to code a dialog for it. You don't need to come up with an error message. You don't have to have it validated by QA or marketing or whomever. You don't have to even go down that path if you prevent the error from happening in the first place. Right? So for example, this is one from Google Docs. If you highlight a piece of code or a piece of text and you right-click on it, guess what? You get a message that says cut, copy, and paste. Okay, cool. If I, for whatever reason, I happen to be in a mode where my hand's on the mouse and I've highlighted a bunch of text, it's really quick for me to then go right-click, copy. Well, guess what? Google Docs, all they do is they throw up an error message that says, haha, that's unavailable, you have to use Control-C instead. Well, then why did you give me that as an option in the first place? That should have been grayed out or not even on the menu. But instead, they've actually led me down a path that I'm put into a situation where not only can I not do what I want, but they have to slap a dialog box up. This is one that I still haven't gotten a good answer for why they do it. But it could have been avoided in a number of different ways. As I mentioned, I teach a graduate course in human-computer interaction, and I've got a nice collection of dialog boxes that I've been building up over the years of error messages that should never ever have seen the light of day. The latest one is from Windows 10. I love that. Something happened. Excellent. I kind of figured that out on my own. These other ones just exhibit various issues kind of along the way. One with the keyboard not responding, press any key to continue. That's a good one. It's going to be tough to do without a keyboard. The ones down the bottom are examples of what I call geek speak. Some engineer thought these were useful, but try showing this error message to your grandmother and see what she thinks about it. It's not too helpful. Moving on, item number 6, providing reversal of actions. This is your safety net for the end user. This is a hard one as engineers. I mean, the short version of this is undo. And I get it. Undo is hard, especially if you've got an application that already exists and it's something that you have to retrofit undo into. It's a challenge. I get it. So architect it in from the beginning if you can. If you can't, think about other things that you can do. Maybe there's an easy way to go back to the last screen, maybe just undo the last things that were typed. Maybe there's a way to restore defaults, reload factory settings if you have to, whatever it might be, but give the user a way to get back to it. This reduces their anxiety that they're going to screw something up. And if you think that's an issue, talk to some elderly folks. Ask people that are in their 80s why they may not like using computers. And an answer that I get a lot is, oh, I'm worried I'm going to break it. And as engineers, we might scoff at that, but again, ask your parents or your grandparents if they don't use computers, ask them why not. I think you'll be surprised what you get for an answer out of that. So when possible, provide that safety net. The alternative is the confirmation dialog. It's not a great alternative because you are adding in an extra click and the ever, yes, I did mean to do that, stop asking me problem. So, there's a mixed bag on it, but arguably for things that are just super crucial, you got to have them. I was just messing around with the backup software that my team uses yesterday, and I was removing a computer from the backup list, and it put up a big old dialogue that said, "Are you really sure you want to do this? Everything's deleted and you can't get it back." And it made me pause for a second and think about it before I clicked OK, but it needed to be there. So, or I guess arguably they might have kept the stuff for 30 days before they nuked it, but that does take up disk space. Okay, so there are choices, but providing that mechanism does help things out. Moving on to item 7, internal locus of control. Everybody likes to believe that they're in control of their own destiny, including how they're using a particular piece of software. You never want to be in a situation where you get to some place within the software and you go, how did I get here? How did I do this? Or, I did this operation yesterday and I can't figure out how to do it today. What's going on? I have no control over this. So, designing for the end user, thinking about their workflows and their mental models is a good way to get past this. But also providing flexibility for them, providing customization, providing personalization. Maybe it's something as simple as letting people bump up the font size or change the font color or change the theme under certain lighting conditions. That gives them the peace of mind that, yeah, I can use the software, I can use it under different conditions or different circumstances, and I can always use it as a valuable tool to get done what I need to. Last one, reducing the short-term memory load. Computers are good at remembering things. They've got plenty of memory in there. People, not so much. So if you've got a situation where you have a workflow that carries a user across multiple screens, don't force them to remember things that happened 3 screens ago, right? There's no reason for it. We can design around that, and it's just plain hard. Short-term memory is highly volatile, and this kind of gets into the cognitive psychology behind user experience design. When you get into issues of kind of task switching or multitasking, of you're working on something and then the phone rings and it's somebody asking you a quick question and you answer the question, you turn back to the screen, you go, what was I just doing? And for those of you who don't think this happens, wait till you get a little bit older. It gets worse as you move along through life. But task switching is a challenge, and the reason for that is just the way the brain is wired. On average, people can only remember 7 plus or minus 2 what are called chunks of information at a time. Beyond that, it gets difficult. And again, that's on average, and there are tricks you can do like repeating things that make it, let you remember more than that, but you got to work at it. So one example of chunking is phone numbers. Right? If I were to give somebody my phone number, I would start with an area code. Now, if you're not from the Boston area and I started a number with 617, that wouldn't necessarily mean anything to you. Those are 3 distinct digits. But if you are from the Boston area and I say 617, you're immediately just going to chunk that in your head and go, oh, yeah, the 617 area code. So that goes from 3 pieces of information to 1 piece of information that I have to remember, and now it's the other 7 digits of the phone number, and suddenly it becomes easier to memorize. That's an example of memory chunking. So just kind of understanding how people's brains work and kind of the cognitive psychology behind it can help you possibly make some better design decisions about what information you put on what screen, what information you cluster together under certain circumstances, and that'll hopefully make things easier for the end users. So from one of the projects we have here at ICS, we have something where an end user is picking colors for projects that they're working on. And we have a drop-down list that's showing a whole bunch of different colors, and I don't have to remember what color is assigned to what. It's taken care of for me by this drop-down. So things that are open colors have none written next to them. Things that have already been picked already have things written down. So I don't have to remember. The software is taking care of it for me. All right? So those are some key pieces of information that should be very actionable for you as developers. Some are going to be more actionable than others, but you should be able to go back to your desks, to whatever projects that you're working on, and some of these should be directly applicable. again, keep in mind consistency and preventing errors. Those are really the top two things that you want to keep in mind when you're developing. For some more information, if you're interested in seeing some discussion on user experience design, at ICS.com, my team's page is ics.com/UXD for UX design. We talk about our philosophy. We list some of these guidelines. We've actually got a good blog series that goes into them in a lot more detail and expands on what I've been talking about here. And we do a bi-weekly blog on our site that talks about various usability issues from different perspectives, some from the developer, some from the end user. We try to make them at least entertaining. Sometimes we succeed, sometimes we don't, but I will let you folks be the judge of that. Another good book to keep in mind, and this is a common question I get, is what's a good book just for beginners to start thinking about design? And it's not a software book. It's The Design of Everyday Things by Donald Norman. And it literally talks about designing physical things, right? If you've ever bumped into a door because you've tried to basically push your way through it, and guess what? The door bounces. It's not a push, it's a pull. That's a design problem. And that's one of the things that they talk about here is just as for instance, putting what are called affordances on things so they behave like you expect them to. Great book. It's an easy read. Highly recommend it. So to recap, user experience design. It is a good thing for your end users, and from a business perspective, it can be a competitive advantage. It will help your company get a head start and a jump over companies that are purely focusing on features right now. User experience design is not necessarily common sense. Some things are, but it's a way of thinking that is different from software engineering. It's putting yourself in the shoes of the people who are going to be using the software, thinking about who they are, when they use the software, where they use it, and really coming up with a design that's going to make sense for them. So know thy user, for you are probably not them. Try to be consistent in the things that you produce. Make errors as impossible as possible. Remember, if they can't make an error in the first place, you don't have to code the dialog. It'll save you some time. And along that lines, do the design first. Work with UX designers, work with people who are experienced in it, or at least go to the whiteboard. Design things out, write it down on paper, run it by somebody and say, hey, does this make sense before I start coding the thing? It will save you time on the end. Designing first really does save coding time later. So that's all I have. Hope you folks have found this interesting or entertaining, and I will throw it open for some questions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jeff. This was really great. We have been getting some questions in. I will encourage you to ask more questions if there's anything that you're interested in getting answered. I think this brought up a lot of good images for me and brought back some memories. I specifically remember teaching my grandfather to use a computer several years ago, and he came from the mindset of being a mechanical engineer, and if you did something wrong, you broke the machine. So I definitely empathize with a lot of what you're saying here.
So yeah, it's a challenge. I mean, my mom is in her 80s at this point, and God bless her, she's plugging along, and she actually took a computer course to help get over some of her computer anxiety, to become comfortable with using it. But my dad wouldn't touch them. He was also mechanically inclined, and I think he had the same mindset you thought of, that it's an expensive piece of equipment, and if I break it, it's a problem. So I'm not even gonna touch it at this point. So it's a challenging problem.
Exactly. So one of the questions we've gotten here, going a little bit back to the beginning of your list, could you say something? Why do you think Rule 1 is the most frequently violated rules, and do you have any hints as to sticking to the rule while developing?
Sure. I think it's the most frequently designed, and admittedly, this is somewhat anecdotal. It's from my experience developing. Just because if you're working on a project team, we've got multiple designers, or I'm sorry, multiple engineers working. If you don't really make an effort to keep in sync with people on other parts of the project, then you're just by definition going to get out of sync. It's going to be impossible that you guys all make the same design decisions, on different pieces if you haven't talked about it together at some point. I mean, literally just something as simple as OK cancel. You got 8 engineers who haven't talked about it and you don't have a style guide, somebody's going to put cancel OK. It's just going to happen. So I think it's probably less so now, I would guess, now that design is really starting to come into people's thoughts more. But certainly years ago when I was doing more heavy coding on teams, it just always came up. I'd be looking at somebody else's code and I'd go, hey, that's different than what I did. We probably should have talked about that. Let's align things. So the solution to preventing it is, one, communication. Just if you're going to be working on pieces of code, try to get a style guide together in the beginning that takes care of some of these common issues, and make sure you follow them. Do your code reviews, compare notes, and try to make sure that you go back and look at other pieces of software that might be relevant. If it's across the company or across the industry, just look around a little bit. The answer should materialize pretty quickly.
Yeah, thank you. And I've gotten another question here that goes a little bit along the same lines, but and admittedly this can be a hard one to answer, but one of the listeners are asking, how can I promote UX design in context where I have little control over the UI, for example, cloud computing backends? And I think it's a great question. A lot of us probably work on areas of the code where we don't necessarily feel that we have control over the user experience, but I still think there's a lot of things we can do to really guide how the user experience will be in the end. I don't know if you have any comment or any solutions to that type of challenge then.
Boy, that is a great one. As a front-end programmer all my years before I started switching into design, one thing that I bumped into was, backends by definition have an API to them, and putting together the API that will give the front-end developers the ability to do the features they want is, might be the way to deal with that. For example, some of my designers are working on a project now where they had a particular design in mind where they wanted to show the status of certain things, and the back-end guy said, yeah, we don't give you that information. And it's like, well, can you? And, well, yeah, we could, and the dance went from there. But providing the right hooks on the back end to let the front end guys build the best experience they can might be the way to kind of do your part from your corner of the world, as it were. So that's one solution.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think that's a great solution, and I think it's a good point that more than just the front-end developers, more people involved in the process should think about the user experience of the application. That might admittedly be hard sometimes, getting out of that engineering bubble and thinking about the end user. But to that point, there's a question on user experience tools, not necessarily just the UI design, but if you have any recommendations or ideas about user experience tools for capturing feedback or usability metrics or stuff like that.
Well, I can speak a little bit to our process here. My designers, when they start a project, the initial part is kind of user research, which is just figuring out what people do, and I mean those are easy, just text gathering tools, just any word processor would work. But when we get to the point where we're creating what are called wireframes, which are very early low fidelity designs, there are a lot of tools out there that can do it, and they can do it very quickly. We use a tool called Axure, A-X-U-R-E. There are others out there, but that's that are industry standards. That's the one we standardized on, which lets us go through and create early prototypes, and it lets us do animations and transitions, and it lets us share our prototype across the web for other people to look at and give us early feedback on it. It's a great tool because it's very quick. I mean, as quick as Qt is to develop things, there's still a cycle of build and compile and send it to somebody, and you got to make sure you compiled it and have the right DLLs if you need to ship it and all those other pieces. So all software has infrastructure. So using a tool that's really designed for rapid prototyping and rapid sharing without any of that other infrastructure, we found it to be a very good win. So that's kind of the process that we use to get early feedback.
And then there's a question here that I really like, and I think there's two parts to it. If you could comment on Qt QML support for user experience for persons with hearing or seeing or mobility impairments. So I think there's at least the way I read this and the way I think of this, there are two parts, and what is kind of supported already with Qt, and then how do you design for those types of special use cases? I don't know if you
Sure,
want to
and
comment on that.
well, I'm gonna honestly have to defer a little bit of that. My QML experience is very dated at this point. I haven't used QML since the 4.x series. For better or for worse, I've been promoted from engineer to director of UX, so I've kind of hung up my coding spurs from that perspective. So I'm admittedly not sure what new features have come around in 5.x to that are give us built-in support. But I will say that QML is an amazingly flexible toolkit to work within. It lets my designers do the best design for people, which can include designing for target users who might have disabilities, and letting us design something that we can give to the engineers to code, that they can really quickly get to something that's pixel perfect from what we designed. If we create an image that has a certain color palette that's going to work well for people with color deficiencies, we can just give that to the engineers, and they can put that right into the QML and do whatever else they need to make it animated or get the right signals from it to do the right thing in the interface. So the advantage that I see is it lets the designers do that type of heavy lifting and figure out what the design needs to be to support that level of usability, and it lets the engineers quickly realize that vision without having to do a whole lot of extra work. Certainly, doing theming is another one. QML is pretty good from that perspective. So if we design multiple themes, say a day-night theme, if the code's certainly written and architected correctly, there's no reason you can't switch themes very easily within QML. So a day-night mode, for instance, is a nice way to overcome, as I said, kind of situational disabilities. Where boy, there's a lot of screen glare on this. If it was darker or lighter or what have you, then it would be much easier for me to read.
Yeah, I think that's great. And just to comment a little bit on the QML specific side, we've actually worked a lot on adding APIs to make Qt accessible. So there are accessibility APIs to make accessibility functionality easy to integrate into your applications. Now, obviously, that is something you need to design in a proper way and present in a good way. We've also gotten some questions regarding the slides, etc. So I'll just recap that. We have both recorded this webinar, and we'll be sending out that to all of those who signed up. You will be able to download the webinar, and you will be able to share it. So don't worry, you do get this material, so that you both can recap it and you can follow up on it. But we also have a lot of questions coming in on the specifics, so we'll try to cover some of those. We still have a little bit of time, but for those of you, if you feel you don't have gotten a proper answer to your question by the end of the session, please follow up with us. We will save all these questions, and we will try to get back to all of you as soon as we can, but don't hesitate to get back to us as well if there's anything. One question here regarding flowcharts, and if there's kind of a user experience guideline how to design this. Should we use flowcharts, or are there any kind of must-haves in that process?
Sure, and actually the short answer is yes. We actually call it a map and flow, but it basically is a flowchart. You can put down all of your screens. You know, if you've done your high level design correctly, where you've gotten to the point of figuring out what screens you're using, and that's a whole separate level of discussion. But certain screens can only take you to certain other screens. You know, for instance, in a medical device, there's some cases where you know you can't jump from screen B to screen F. So when you lay all that out, you know, be it on a whiteboard or in a design tool, you know you can show the linkages between them, and you know how one screen will get you to the other, and what, you know, you can even go deeper from a developer's perspective in terms of what signals might transition you from screening from transitioning from one screen to the next. But yeah, we call it a map and flow, but honestly, it basically is a flow chart, and that really is a standard way of just figuring out what is your screen hierarchy, and you know how do you go from, you know, one screen to what other screens that are accessible.
Thank you. And there's a great question here that I really like, and that I would also like to have an answer to. But I don't know if there is one answer to this, but maybe you can give a comment. How do you keep consistency throughout multiple products? And you talked about this already, but between desktop apps, web apps, mobile apps, all of which developed by different teams in the company, but used by the same user. So you certainly touched upon this a little bit, but do you have any suggestions or hints there?
Boy, that's a challenging one, and I mean, I really don't have a silver bullet answer on that one. I mean, the answer really is communication. It helps if you have a central designer, you know, whether it's the product manager, or you know, an in-house UX team, or you know, whomever, but somebody whose job it is just to keep track of these things. Um, it's hard, especially when you have legacy code and you're developing a new version and you want to keep certain paradigms that need to be brought forward so you don't alienate old users. I don't have a silver bullet answer, except it comes down to design. It comes down to process, you know, just in terms of, you know, looking at your target applications, if you will, looking at the history of what's out there, doing a design that is proper for whatever the new system is, and you know, keeping that design as input for the next product's design. So, but it's I mean, there are things that you can do once you build up a history of things, in terms of maybe you create a pattern library and you start applying it to new products, you know, that says all products shall use this font, and it's coded into a QML object somewhere, and that becomes a starting point for new products. You know, that's a way to start to codify things, but you know, getting there is manual. You know, just figuring out what the right answer is, and then determining how you codify that going forward, and you know, just making sure that you use that design decision as you go forward. So it's a
Yeah.
challenge.
Um, I think maybe we have time for one or two more questions. There's one question here that I really like, and that I maybe can give part of the answer to. But if we had any thoughts on the future of user experience and how Qt fits into that future, and the example the question gives here is more dynamic or interactive UI elements, and user interfaces for virtual reality or augmented reality. I don't know if you want to touch upon that, Jeff.
Boy, that really is a great one. On my blog series, I actually talk a lot about futures, and I mean the example I use a lot, quite frankly, is I want to be Tony Stark. You know, I really I want to have a full Jarvis system interface to my house where I can use voice commands. I want to have a, you know, large screens, holographic things that I can drag and drop and push with amazing graphics, and you know, have access to a heads-up display that I can even trigger things with my eyes, and it gives me an augmented reality view of the world. And yeah, I want to be Tony Stark, and if Qt can get me there, wonderful. But there are products that are out there that are coming along in that vein. I drive my whole house right now off of an Amazon Echo, just a little product placement there. But I come in every night from work and I say, you know, turn on the lights, and Alexa, turn on the kitchen lights, and it does it for me. It's about 90-something% accurate, but that's pretty good. So, going in that direction of voice-activated user interfaces. I was actually just talking with a colleague today who was speaking about an elderly parent who's having trouble with their vision, and now that parent is listening to audiobooks more, but he can't trigger the audiobooks. Well, he could trigger them through a voice-activated command. So I could say, play my book, and it triggers. So I think designing, both for disabilities and for these future technologies, it's a very exciting challenge. I think we've got a lot of reference user interfaces out there that might be fictional now. Gestures is another big one. People always think of Minority Report, but gesture interfaces are starting to come out there. The Wii, the Microsoft Kinect. These science fiction technologies are just slowly becoming reality. And I think that's just going to continue as we go forward, and it'll make for a very interesting world as we roll these technologies out.
Absolutely, I very much agree with you there. And I would like to say to the other part of that question, that how Qt fits into this future. I think the future is always a little bit unknown. We don't know that 100%, but this is certainly very interesting areas of research where here at our offices we are playing around with VR, we are playing around with AR. Qt is already being used, and I think QML has enabled us to really branch out of the desktop first user interface world that Qt was created for more than 20 years ago, and with QML today it's possible to create any of these modern flexible user interfaces that have very different requirements than user interfaces used to have 10-15 years ago. So we see multiple of the players creating these virtual reality ecosystems today are actually already using Qt for parts of that. So I think certainly Qt can be a great vehicle to bring user experiences into these new areas.
Sure, absolutely. And if I could just interject, just something I remembered too. Several years ago, when the Leap Motion came out, the little desktop gestural device, that was one of the last pieces of code that I was playing with. I actually wrote a Qt interface for the Leap Motion camera in an afternoon. I mean, I was very quickly, I had a piece of Qt code that was properly responding to me doing gestural interfaces and giving me the right signals that showed what I did with my fingers, and I could trigger an interface that way. So it was very easy to do, and it proved very engaging for what little I did with it. But definitely Qt is going to be well in the mix for these new technologies.
Yes. And with that, I think it's a great place to end the session, looking a little bit into the future there. We're already a little bit over the hour now. Thank you very much for everybody who came and listened to this. Thank you very much, Jeff, for taking the time and presenting this great content. We still have a bunch of questions here that we haven't been able to, or we haven't had the time to answer, but we will get around to answering those. And if there's anything in particular you want to know, more than just the short one-line question you've asked us here, feel free to follow up with us. And as I've said already, yes, we will be sharing the recording and the slides. It might take a little while to process everything, but we will certainly do that. So again, thank you very much, Jeff. Thank you for listening, everybody, and have a nice day.